Usually, when we talk about true crime, we are talking about a heist or, I don't know, maybe a forensic investigation into a cold case.
Right.
But today, we are pulling apart a biological true crime story, one that took place entirely inside the human bloodstream, and it ended up affecting millions of people.
Yeah, and it is a narrative built on incredibly good intentions, absolutely brilliant science, and a massive, just devastating blind spot that the scientific community simply refused to see until it was way too late.
Totally. So to get to the bottom of this, we have pulled together a pretty hefty stack of sources for this deep dive. We are looking at decades-old medical journals, the original clinical trial data that completely shocked the pharmaceutical industry, and some really blistering FDA congressional testimonies from the early 2000s.
It's a lot of material, but it paints a wild picture.
It really does. The mission here is to understand how the quest to build the quote-unquote perfect targeted anti-inflammatory drug led to one of the most disastrous medical miscalculations in modern history. And to ground this, I want you, the listener, to think about the last time you tweaked your back or had a terrible headache or, maybe your knees were aching after a run. You probably reached into your medicine cabinet and swallowed an anti-inflammatory drug.
Like almost everybody does, yeah.
Right. And if you've ever taken those drugs on an empty stomach or maybe taken them for a few days in a row, you know that familiar gnawing stomach burn.
Oh, yeah. Which is the hallmark side effect of traditional non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. We call them NSAIDs for short.
Right. NSAIDs.
You know them as ibuprofen, naproxen, or aspirin. And, they are incredibly effective at reducing pain and swelling, but they come with a brutal toll on the gastrointestinal tract.
So this entire saga is really about a billion-dollar pharmaceutical race to eliminate that exact stomach-burning side effect. The goal was to build a flawless, targeted painkiller.
Exactly.
But before we get to the disaster part, we really have to rewind, because we need to understand the elegant, almost seductive logic that made the scientific community fall in love with the idea of these drugs in the first place.
Yeah, you have to see why they thought this was going to save the world.
Right, and this story actually starts with aspirin, which is a drug we use for over a century without actually knowing the mechanism behind it.
Right, people just accepted it as this magical white pill from willow bark that made pain and fever go away. It was purely empirical medicine. You took it, you felt better, end of story.
No one knew why it worked.
Exactly. But in 1971, a British pharmacologist named Sir John Vane completely cracked the code. He published a landmark finding that aspirin and aspirin-like drugs don't actually work by magic. They work by specifically inhibiting the synthesis of something called prostaglandins.
Okay, and just as a quick refresher, prostaglandins being the chemical messengers in our bodies responsible for driving inflammation, pain, and fever.
You got it. So Vane discovered that aspirin actively blocks the specific enzyme responsible for manufacturing those pain-causing prostaglandins. And that enzyme is called cyclooxygenase, or COX for short.
COX, right, COX.
Yeah, and this discovery was so monumental in understanding how the human body processes pain that it actually earned Vane a share of the 1982 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
Wow, so a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough.
It was huge. And for years after that, the scientific consensus was just a very neat closed loop. Pain happens because of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are made by the single COX enzyme, and aspirin blocks the COX enzyme. Problem solved.
Very tidy.
Right. But the plot thickened significantly in 1991. Several research groups, including labs led by Harvey Hirschman at UCLA and Daniel Simmons at Brigham Young University, realized the textbook was actually missing a chapter. There wasn't just one COX enzyme. There were two completely different versions operating in the body.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, this was the pivotal insight that threw the whole pharmacological world into overdrive. The original enzyme they cloned back in 1988 is what we now call COX-1. But that 1991 discovery identified a second, distinct form of the enzyme, which they named COX-2.
So suddenly, scientists realized they were dealing with a good cop, bad cop dynamic on a cellular level.
Exactly, a classic good cop, bad cop setup.
All right, let's break down these cops for a second, starting with COX-1, the good cop.
So COX-1 is what biologists call a constitutive enzyme.
Constitutive, meaning what exactly?
It basically means it is expressed continuously all the time in most tissues of your body to handle routine, day-to-day housekeeping jobs.
Okay. just keeping the lights on.
Exactly. And crucially, it manufactures the specific prostaglandins that act as a protective shield for your stomach lining, defending it against its own digestive acid. It also maintains normal, healthy blood flow through your kidneys.
So it's essential. Then you have the bad cop, COX-2, which operates under completely different rules.
Right. COX-2 is like a dormant villain. In healthy, normal tissue, COX-2 is largely turned off. It just sits there. It only gets switched on or induced by inflammatory triggers.
Oh, I see.
So if you suffer a physical tissue injury or if inflammatory cytokines flood an area, COX-2 wakes up right at the site of the trauma. And it immediately starts pumping out the prostaglandins that cause severe pain and swelling.
Okay, so looking at it through this dual enzyme lens, the problem with traditional NSAIDs like aspirin or ibuprofen becomes just glaringly obvious. They are essentially biological carpet bombs.
That is the perfect way to describe it, a carpet bomb.
You take an ibuprofen for a sprained ankle, and the chemical just washes through your entire system, wiping out both enzymes indiscriminately. It destroys COX-2, which successfully cures the pain in your ankle, but it simultaneously demolishes COX-1.
Right, completely destroying the protective housekeeping shield in your stomach.
Leaving the stomach lining highly vulnerable to its own acid.
Yes, and a meaningful fraction of chronic NSAID users eventually end up with severe stomach ulcers and gastrointestinal bleeding because of this exact mechanism. We were curing the joint pain, but wrecking the stomach lining as this sort of unavoidable collateral damage.
Which is awful if you have chronic pain like rheumatoid arthritis and have to take these pills every single day.
Exactly, and this realization is what birthed the 1990s pharmaceutical gold rush.
The logic was irresistible, right? If traditional drugs are carpet bombs, we need to build a laser-guided missile.
A drug engineered chemically to only bind to the COX-2 villain, leaving the COX-1 good cop completely untouched to protect the stomach.
Yes. They called it the selectivity hypothesis.
Yeah.
And mechanistically, I mean, it was beautiful. If you could inhibit COX-2 exclusively, you could offer patients incredible relief from arthritis and acute pain with virtually zero risk of gastrointestinal bleeding.
The holy grail of rheumatology.
Exactly. It was the holy grail, which led directly to the rapid FDA approval of the first highly selective COX-2 inhibitor, celecoxib, which most people know as Celebrex. That hit the market in December 1998. And then, just months later, in May 1999, Merck launched their own heavyweight contender, rofecoxib, which they aggressively marketed as Vioxx.
Vioxx, yeah. The medical community called this whole new class of drugs the coxibs, and they achieved blockbuster status almost overnight.
Because the laser-guided missile worked flawlessly on paper. Right?
Yeah, doctors were just thrilled to finally have a safe option for their chronic pain patients. The prescriptions were flying out the door.
Unfortunately, as this deep dive shows, biology is rarely a simple one-to-one equation. We engineered a drug to solve a specific problem, but targeting COX-2 so aggressively threw a completely unseen, massively important biological system into chaos.
Total cascade of chaos.
Literally a cascade. Because to understand the trap they walk blindly into, we have to pull out the microscope and look at the underlying mechanics. The source material refers to this as the arachidonic acid cascade.
Right. So picture a complex chain reaction inside the cell. When a cell membrane is disturbed by an injury, an enzyme called phospholipase A2 activates.
Okay.
And it snips a specific fatty acid, called arachidonic acid, right out of the cell membrane and releases it into the cell.
Whoa, okay, let's pause there for a second, because phospholipase A2 arachidonic acid, that is a lot of terminology all at once. Let me try to visualize this. It sounds a bit like a cellular factory assembly line. Arachidonic acid is basically the raw material, like steel arriving at the loading dock, right?
Yeah, that is actually a perfect way to look at it. Arachidonic acid is the raw material. The cyclooxygenase enzymes are two managers, COX-1 and TOX-2. They take that raw steel and convert it into a transitional component called prostaglandin H2.
Okay, so both managers can use the raw material.
Right. But from there, the assembly line forks and downstream enzymes convert that component into a whole family of highly specialized active molecules.
And this fork in the assembly line is where the fatal imbalance happens, right? Because manager 1 is doing something totally different than manager 2 down the line.
Exactly. So down one branch of this fork, operating in the walls of your blood vessels, COX-2 oversees the creation of a molecule called prostacyclin.
Prostacyclin.
Right. And prostacyclin serves a vital function. It heavily dilates your blood vessels, keeping them wide open, and it actively repels platelets, stopping them from clumping together.
Oh, wow. So COX-2 is actively manufacturing the body's anti-clotting brake pedal. It keeps the traffic flowing.
Yes, the brake pedal. Now look at the other branch of the assembly line, controlled by AOX1. Inside your blood platelets, COX-1 oversees the creation of a different molecule called thromboxane A2.
Let me guess, it does the opposite.
The exact opposite. Thromboxane A2 physically constricts your blood vessels, narrowing the pathway, and it makes your platelets incredibly sticky, heavily promoting clotting.
Meaning COX-1 manufactures the pro-clotting gas pedal.
Exactly.
So in a normal, healthy body, prostacyclin and thromboxane A2 are constantly pushing against each other in this delicate, perfect balance. The brakes and the gas are calibrated.
Calibrated perfectly.
And when you take a traditional carpet bomb NSAID like ibuprofen, you fire both factory managers at once. You block both COX-1 and POX-2.
Right, so you reduce the anti-clotting molecules and the pro-clotting molecules at the exact same time. The overall scale stays balanced. The blood doesn't become significantly more or less likely to clot.
Okay, wait, this actually explains a completely different medical mystery for me. This is why millions of people take low-dose aspirin as a blood thinner to prevent heart attacks, isn't it?
Yes, the mechanism is identical. Aspirin permanently destroys COX-1 in platelets. And because platelets are unique little cell fragments that lack a nucleus, they literally cannot manufacture new COX-1 enzymes.
Oh, so they're just dead in the water.
Basically. So for the entire 10-day lifespan of that platelet, the thromboxane, the pro-clotting gas pedal, is completely broken. This gives aspirin a highly durable anti-clotting effect that persists long after the actual drug has left your system.
That's wild. Okay, so let's apply this factory assembly line analogy to the new drugs, the highly selective COX-2 inhibitors like Vioxx. By leaving the good COX-1 entirely alone, they successfully avoided stomach ulcers. But they unknowingly fired the manager making the anti-clotting solvent, while leaving the manager making the sticky clotting cement working overtime.
That is the trap. The precision of the drug became its fatal flaw. By selectively shutting down the body's natural vasodilator and anti-clotting agent, while leaving the clotting promoter running at maximum capacity, they inadvertently force the vascular system into a highly prothrombotic state.
Prothrombotic meaning prone to clots.
Exactly. They engineered a chemical environment that heavily favored the formation of dangerous blood clots.
They intentionally turned off the cardiovascular brakes while the gas pedal was glued to the floor. That is absolutely terrifying.
It is, and it just demonstrates how dangerously interconnected this entire biochemical cascade is. I mean, the body's network doesn't like being manipulated in isolation. For instance, if you block the COX enzymes entirely, the cell doesn't just politely stop producing the arachidonic acid raw material. That raw material continues to arrive at the factory dock, it builds up, and eventually gets shoved down a completely different neighboring pathway called the lipoxygenase pathway.
Where does that overflow lead?
It leads to the creation of molecules called leukotrienes, and leukotrienes are heavily involved in bronchoconstriction, the physical narrowing of the airways in your lungs.
Wait, really?
Yeah, this beautifully explains a clinical phenomenon where giving traditional NSAIDs to patients with severe asthma can suddenly trigger a life-threatening asthma attack.
Oh.
Because the raw material gets forced down the alternate pathway, flooding the lungs with constricting signals. Researchers are even debating the existence of a third variant, sometimes referred to as COX-3, primarily located in the central nervous system.
Which does what?
Well, it might explain why a drug like acetaminophen Tylenol can reduce pain and fever in the brain, but does absolutely nothing to reduce physical swelling in a sprained ankle.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
You pull one biological lever and a trapdoor swings open in a completely different organ system.
Exactly. Everything is connected.
But okay, let's get back to the blood vessels.
Yeah.
Because that theoretical imbalance, the gas without the brakes, that didn't stay a quiet theoretical worry for very long, did it?
No, it did not.
It manifested violently in massive clinical trials. But I think the human element of this story is just as fascinating as the biology. Because when the data started screaming that something was wrong, human bias simply refused to listen.
Yeah, the denial was incredibly strong.
Right around the year 2000, researchers conducted a massive study called the VIGOR trial. VIGOR stood for Vioxx Gastrointestinal Outcomes Research. They pitted Vioxx against a traditional NSAID naproxen in over 8,000 rheumatoid arthritis patients.
And on its primary stated goal, the trial was an unmitigated triumph. The patients taking Vioxx experienced roughly half the rate of serious gastrointestinal complications compared to those taking naproxen. The laser-guided missile successfully bypassed the stomach.
But buried in the safety data was a total nightmare. The Vioxx group showed a roughly four-fold increase in heart attacks compared to the naproxen group.
Yeah.
I mean, are you telling me highly trained scientists saw a 400% spike in heart attacks and just shrugged it off to keep selling the drug?
Well, it wasn't a malicious shrug, exactly. It's a profound cognitive dissonance. You really have to understand the psychology at play here.
Okay, explain that.
The researchers and the manufacturer were so deeply invested in the mechanistically beautiful theory of their drug and, frankly, the billions of dollars it represented, that they just couldn't fathom it was actively causing cardiac arrest. So they rationalized the data by looking really closely at the comparator drug, naproxen.
The carpet bomb.
Right. And they hypothesized that naproxen must possess some magical, undiscovered cardioprotective quality.
Wait, so they convinced themselves that naproxen was acting just like daily aspirin, super protecting the heart, which made Vioxx look artificially bad simply by comparison.
That was the official defense. Seriously. Because naproxen hits both enzymes, they assumed its mild antiplatelet effect was actively driving the heart attack rate down in the control group, rather than admitting Vioxx was actively driving the heart attack rate up in the test group.
That is some serious mental gymnastics.
It really was. And that highly flawed defensive interpretation was accepted by a lot of people in the medical community for years, while tens of millions of prescriptions were confidently handed to patients.
It is staggering how a brilliant theory can completely blind smart people to ugly reality.
Truly.
And it wasn't until a second major trial, known as the April-Proof trial, that the undeniable truth finally broke through the denial.
Right, the AP-Proof trial, which was actually designed to test Vioxx for a completely unrelated use, preventing the recurrence of colon polyps. But the crucial difference here was the study design.
Different how?
The comparator drug wasn't naproxen, it was a placebo, a pharmacologically inert sugar pill.
Meaning there was no hypothetical magical cardioprotective drug to blame the bad numbers on this time.
Exactly. And after about 18 months of continuous patient use, the Independent Safety Monitoring Board halted the trial. The data was glaring.
What did it show?
The patients taking Vioxx had roughly double the rate of confirmed cardiovascular events, heart attacks and strokes, compared to the patients taking the sugar pill. The biological trap of the arachidonic acid cascade was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Man. So on September 30th, 2004, Merck voluntarily withdrew Vioxx from the global market. And at the time of its withdrawal, the drug had been heavily marketed to and used by an estimated 80 million people worldwide.
80 million. It stands as one of the largest, most disruptive prescription drug withdrawals in the history of medicine.
And the human cost is chilling to contemplate. During congressional hearings, David Graham, who was a prominent FDA safety officer at the time, delivered a blistering testimony. He estimated that during its 5 years on the market, Vioxx may have been associated with 88,000 to 140,000 excess cases of serious coronary heart disease in the United States alone.
Just in the U.S., and a substantial share of those cardiovascular events were fatal. While epidemiological estimates always carry a degree of statistical uncertainty, the sheer unprecedented scale of those numbers triggered an avalanche of mass litigation.
I can imagine.
Yeah, in 2007, Merck agreed to a monumental $4.85 billion settlement to resolve tens of thousands of patient lawsuits. And while they didn't officially admit fault, a settlement of that magnitude signals just how catastrophic the miscalculation of cardiovascular risk truly was.
Absolutely. Now, if you're listening to this and worrying about the medications currently sitting in your bathroom cabinet, let's clarify a crucial detail. Vioxx was pulled, but it wasn't the only casualty, right?
No, Pfizer had a similar drug called valdecoxib, marketed as Bextra, which was also pulled from the market in 2005 due to cardiovascular risks and a rare, severe skin reaction.
But if these drugs are so universally lethal, why do I still know people who take Celebrex today? Why didn't the FDA just ban the entire category?
Well, that question sparked a massive debate following the Vioxx fallout. Was this a Vioxx-specific toxicity problem, or was it a class effect, meaning every single drug that inhibits COX-2 is a ticking cardiovascular time bomb?
Right.
But celecoxib, or Celebrex, survived the purge. And to understand why, we have to dismantle a major scientific misconception about how drug selectivity actually functions in the human body. Originally, the medical community treated COX-2 selectivity like a binary light switch.
So people assumed a drug is either a COX-2 inhibitor or it isn't. You're either pregnant or you're not.
Exactly, but pharmacological selectivity is not a light switch. It acts much more like a volume dial. It's a continuous, highly variable spectrum based on the precise ratio of how much drug concentration is required to inhibit COX-1 versus how much is required to inhibit COX-2.
Ah, okay. So it's dose dependent. The volume matters.
Yes, celecoxib is actually only moderately selective. It has roughly a 7 to 10-fold preference for binding to COX-2. Rofecoxib was dialed up to an extreme degree. Its preference for targeting COX-2 over QX1 was massive by comparison.
Which means Vioxx created a vastly more severe imbalance between the pro-clotting and anti-clotting molecules on that cellular assembly line we talked about.
You got it. And this specific hypothesis was rigorously evaluated years later in a landmark study called the Precision Trial, led by researcher Stephen Nissen and published in 2016.
And what did they find?
They demonstrated that celecoxib, when prescribed at moderate doses, actually possessed a cardiovascular safety profile that was comparable to traditional NSAIDs like ibuprofen and naproxen.
Interesting. So that reframes the entire disaster. The lethal risk is heavily dictated by the specific molecular structure, the exact dosage, and the duration of use, rather than the pure underlying concept of COX-2 selectivity being fundamentally deadly at all levels.
Exactly. Which brings us to the ultimate ironic twist in this entire pharmacological saga, which is the diclofenac paradox.
Oh, this part is wild. Because diclofenac is a drug millions of people use globally. In many countries, you can buy it straight over the counter. And for decades, the medical establishment confidently classified it as a traditional non-selective NSAID.
Yeah.
It sits right next to standard ibuprofen on the pharmacy shelf, seemingly totally unrelated to the whole Vioxx scandal.
Right. Yet when pharmacologists finally subjected diclofenac to rigorous modern testing, they uncovered something astonishing. At the standard clinical doses people actually consume every day, diclofenac is functionally highly preferential to COX-2.
Right.
Inside the body, it suppresses COX-2 far more aggressively than QX1.
Meaning diclofenac is basically a powerful COX-2 inhibitor walking around in a cheap disguise.
Functionally speaking, yes. Even though it was never branded or marketed as a coxib, large-scale epidemiological studies have subsequently shown that diclofenac carries a cardiovascular risk profile that is comparable to, or in some cases even exceeds, some of the actual engineered coxibs.
Because the human body fundamentally does not care what clever marketing category is printed on the cardboard box. It only reacts to the functional biological balance the chemical creates once it crosses into your bloodstream.
Precisely. And while we are clearing up lingering misconceptions, it is vital to note that even the surviving coxibs like Celebrex are not completely free of gastrointestinal risk.
Right.
I mean, they do substantially reduce the likelihood of developing stomach ulcers compared to older drugs, but they do not eliminate the risk entirely.
And this becomes especially critical when you consider how drugs interact with each other in the real world. A huge percentage of older adults take a daily low-dose aspirin to protect their heart.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous combo. If you take a daily aspirin, which, remember, irreversibly blocks COX-1 in the stomach lining, and you concurrently take a COX-2 inhibitor for your arthritis, you effectively cancel out the entire gastrointestinal advantage of the expensive coxib.
So you expose yourself to the stomach bleeding risks of a traditional NSAI while simultaneously carrying whatever cardiovascular exposure the coxib brings.
Yes, you are paying a premium for the worst of both worlds.
Unbelievable. And, speaking of gastrointestinal data, we cannot finish this deep dive without addressing the blatant deception of the CLASSTAR trial in the year 2000.
Oh, man. The CLASS trial, it remains a textbook example of scientific reporting failure.
Yeah.
The CLASS trial was explicitly designed to prove celecoxib's gastrointestinal safety advantage over older drugs. And when the results were proudly published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the data looked fantastic. Celecoxib appeared to be a miracle drug for the stomach.
Until a blistering critique published in The Lancet in 2002 pointed out a massive intentional omission by the researchers. The heavily promoted paper only reported the first 6 months of safety data from a clinical trial that had actually run for a full 12 months.
Right, and when independent researchers finally demanded and examined the complete 12-month dataset, celecoxib's vaunted gastrointestinal safety advantage over the comparator drugs largely evaporated into statistical noise.
It just vanished.
it vanished. It became a permanent cautionary tale about the immense dangers of selective reporting and why firmly pre-registered trial endpoints are absolutely vital to scientific integrity.
So pulling all of this clinical history and biochemical biology together, the journey of the COX-2 inhibitors represents a massive cautionary tale. We had a mechanistically brilliant idea, the laser-guided missile to neutralize inflammation without destroying the stomach. But the theoretical arrogance vastly outran the clinical evidence.
Yeah, it really did.
Millions of people safely take celecoxib today, but the Vioxx saga forever changed the landscape of modern medicine. I mean, it is the precise reason the FDA now aggressively mandates a stark black box cardiovascular warning for all NSAIDs, both traditional and coxib alike.
Yeah, and it also triggered a radical reformation of post-market drug surveillance. Regulatory agencies were forced to admit they could no longer just approve a drug based on controlled trials and hope for the best. They had to implement systems to aggressively monitor adverse events in the chaotic real world, because a pristine clinical trial of 8,000 people might easily mask a fatal biological flaw that only reveals itself when 80 million people start swallowing the pill.
Exactly. We started this deep dive by comparing this to a biological true crime. We identified the culprit, we mapped out the weapon, the arachidonic acid cascade, and the regulatory system has, thankfully, constructed much stronger guardrails to prevent this specific trap from springing again.
But studying this history forces a much broader, deeply unsettling question.
What's that?
Well, think about the diclofenac revelation. If a universally trusted traditional drug like the diclofenac was actually a highly selective COX-2 inhibitor hiding in plain sight for decades, what else don't we know?
Oh, wow.
Right. As we move into an era of personalized genomics and incredibly powerful AI drug modeling, how many other common, everyday drugs currently sitting in our medicine cabinets will be exposed as operating under false identities?
That is wild to think about.
How many decades-old pills are behaving inside our cells in ways that completely contradict the neat, simple labels we've slapped on their boxes?
That is a terrifying and fascinating thought to leave on. Keep questioning what you read on the block, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Catch you next time.